What's up, guys? Welcome back to Woodlands Plus. I'm Dan the Man. I'll be hosting today. It's gonna be epic, incredible, dare I say it, unforgettable. This episode, it's gonna be a blast. I think Christian's around here somewhere. He's supposed to have
Hey guys, we've got a brand new segment here on this episode called 12 and 42, where we take a staff member and ask them 12 questions in 42 seconds. Let's get to it. Spencer! Hey! Brand new contestant on 12 and 42, where we ask you 12 questions in 42 seconds. Are you ready?
Yes.
Timer starts now. What's your favorite drink?
A Mountain Dew Baja Blast.
What's your dream car?
A Corvette.
What website do you visit most often?
Probably Instagram.
What's your favorite color?
Green.
What's the capital of Assyria?
Syria City.
Sweet! What fictional place would you most like to go?
Narnia.
What's your favorite animal?
Dog.
Would you rather have hot dogs for fingers or toes?
Toes.
Who has the best facial hair on staff at Woodlands?
Cole, just to tell us.
Batman or Spider-Man?
Spider-Man.
Favorite milkshake flavor?
Coffee.
Funniest person on staff?
Oh boy. Christian.
Hey, that was great. Thank you, Spencer. Coming up here, great stuff. Big John, leading quiet time. It's gonna be great.
Let's do it.
In the first 3 episodes of Woodlands Plus, we tried to help you build a plan for reading the Bible for yourself. And we said that plan revolves around 3 key questions. What do I read? What do I look for? And how do I find it? Then in episode 4, we turned the page and we started a jet tour through the first 3 months of the Woodlands reading plan, getting you caught up on the major storyline that's happened since January 1st. And we said in the beginning that God created everything. And he created it good, and especially good was God's most prized creation, that being Adam and Eve, humanity. And he made Adam and Eve perfect. There was no sin or sickness or sadness, and he put them in this perfect place to live called the Garden of Eden, and he gave them a perfect friendship with himself. But he also gave them one rule. And as you may remember, Adam and Eve made the decision to disobey God. Over time, that sin corrupted the entire world. So much so that God selected one individual, a man named Abraham. And God made a covenant with Abraham. God said to Abraham, he said, Abraham, I'm going to make out of you a brand new nation. And I'm going to give that nation a place to live. And through that nation, I'm going to bless all the nations of the entire earth. Abraham then had a son named Isaac. Isaac had twin sons, Jacob and Esau. Jacob had 12 sons, including a boy named Joseph. Joseph was sold by his brothers into slavery in Egypt. Through a crazy set of circumstances, Joseph went from being a slave to a prisoner to the prime minister of the entire country. God then used a famine in that area of the world to bring Joseph's family, including his father Jacob, to Egypt. Pharaoh told Joseph, put your family in the best part of the land, an area called Goshen. And over the course of the next 400 years, that little family of 70 people grew into a people group of about 2 million people. After that 400 years, the new Pharaoh didn't know anything about the Pharaoh of 400 years ago, and he didn't know anything about Joseph. He just saw this people group of 2 million people. They weren't Egyptians. They were kind of this big, ginormous glob of a family living in the land of Egypt, and the new Pharaoh saw them as a threat. He thought if they decide to revolt, they could really do some damage from the inside of our country. So the new Pharaoh said, I want all of the baby Hebrew boys that are born to be killed. Well, one of those little boys was a boy named Moses. And Moses' mama, after he was born, she built a little boat and she put the baby in the boat and she sent that boat down the Nile River. And that boat was found by none other than Pharaoh's daughter. Pharaoh's daughter sees this little Hebrew baby and decides to adopt it as her own and raises this little baby in Pharaoh's palace. Now, this is an important point because God was going to someday use Moses to deliver his people out of Egypt. But in the meantime, God actually had Moses educated and raised in Egypt, which at that time was the most advanced educational system in the entire world. Well, as Moses grew up, one day Moses saw a Hebrew and an Egyptian in a fight. And Moses stepped in and he killed the Egyptian. So from that point on, Moses fled for his life and he went to a land called Midian. While in Midian, he met his wife, he got married, and he's just kind of on the back 40 of nowhere, taking care of some sheep. And God appears to Moses in a burning bush. And he tells Moses, Moses, I want you to go back to Egypt. And I want you to face down Pharaoh. And I want you to tell him to let my covenant people go. Moses protests, and finally he decides to go back. And so Moses and his brother Aaron, they go back and they square off with Pharaoh. And you may remember the story. This is where all of those crazy plagues of flies and frogs and gnats and blood and darkness and hail and all this crazy stuff happens, all the way up to the final plague that God sent of killing the firstborn of all the Egyptians. And Pharaoh finally relents and says, okay, your people can leave the country. And so the Hebrews, they leave Egypt and they go and they bump into the Red Sea. Well, right about that time, Pharaoh decides, I made a huge mistake. I just lost our entire labor force. So he sends the army to chase them down. Well, the Hebrews find themselves pinned between the Red Sea and the Egyptian army. But Moses tells them this. He says, don't fear. Be still. God's going to fight for you. And he did. God appeared as a wall of fire between the Hebrews and the Egyptians. The next day, God parted the waters of the Red Sea. The Hebrews were allowed to escape on dry ground. The Egyptians, as they tried to follow the Red Sea, God caused it to crash in on top of them. And in front of the Hebrews' eyes, God delivered them. They got on the other side of the Red Sea and they started heading toward the land that God had promised Abraham in his covenant generations before. Well, they get to the base of a mountain called Mount Sinai. And God tells Moses that he wants to meet with Moses face to face on top of this mountain. So Moses goes up on top of that mountain, and there at that mountain, God establishes a covenant, not with one person, but God establishes a covenant with his people. And he says in this covenant with the people of Israel, or what would soon to be Israel, he says in this covenant with the Hebrew people, he says, I am going to set you apart. You're not going to be like the pagan nations that live in this area of the world. And I'm going to make out of you a kingdom of priests. You're going to go as my representatives to the world, and you're going to show the world that my way is better, God said. And through you, I'm going to connect the world to me. And the terms of that covenant was what was called the law. You probably recognize the first 10 laws of the law, that being the 10 commandments. And from there, God gave them laws about the sacrificial system and about the purification system and just about how they were to do life with one another. And then God gave them laws for how to set up the tabernacle. And ultimately, once they had all of these laws in place, they set off toward the land that God had promised Abraham. Well, as they got close to the land that God promised Abraham, Moses sent out 12 spies to go check out the land. As the 12 spies came back, 10 of them said, this land, there's no way we can take this land. The people that live there are ginormous. They're going to squash us like bugs. But 2 of the spies, Joshua and Caleb, came back and said, no, we can totally do this. God is on our side. This land is incredible. It's a land flowing with milk and honey. God is going to fight for us. We can do this. But the 10 bad spies went throughout the Hebrew people and they convinced them that this was a bad idea. And so ultimately God told the Hebrews, he said, okay, cool. If you're not going to walk in obedience, if you're not going to be willing to enter into the land out of fear, then I'm going to have you walk around in the wilderness for 40 years until this entire generation dies off. And then the next generation will get to see the fulfillment of my covenant with Abraham. And so finally, after walking around in the wilderness for 40 years, that generation died off, and they get to the point where they're ready to cross into the promised land. And God allows Abraham to look into the promised land before he dies. And Abraham gives the people, the Hebrew people, this speech. And in this speech, in Deuteronomy 28, and this is so important, he says, listen, God wanted me to tell you that he wants to be your king and he wants you to be his people. And if you will just obey, God is going to provide for you, and he's going to protect you, and he's going to guide you, and he's going to direct you. But if you choose to disobey, if you choose to rebel against God, God says the deal's off, that you're on your own, that he's not going to act on your behalf, that he's not going to guide and direct and provide and protect. And so Moses says, please obey. And in one of his final charges to the people of Israel, Moses says, you've got all of these laws, 613 of them in all. But he says, you're going to find that you're not going to be able to keep these laws, that you're going to break these laws. Because ultimately, rules or laws can dictate your behavior, but they can't change your heart. And so Moses said, what you're going to need is you're going to need someday for God to give you a new heart. And not long after that speech, Moses died. And a new man stepped up to take over. A man that God put in charge of the Israelites that would lead them across the Jordan into the promised land. And his name was Joshua. And as you can imagine, Joshua, he's taking over just this mass group of people of about 2 million people, and he's leading them into foreign territory. And there's a lot of hostile nations in that foreign territory. You've got to imagine that Joshua was probably a little bit nervous. And in one of my favorite verses in all of Scripture, God says to Joshua in Joshua 1:9, he says, Joshua, be strong and courageous. Don't be terrified. Don't be discouraged. For the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. And that's such a good word for us. That even in these confusing and kind of scary times, God says, be strong and courageous. Don't be afraid. Don't be discouraged. Because God says, I'm with you every step along the way. So they're on the shore of the Jordan River, preparing to cross the Jordan River into the land that God had promised in a covenant to Abraham generations ago. But the Bible says the Jordan River was at flood stage. And they've got 2 million people and animals and babies and old people that they're going to have to try to get across this river. And so in this dramatic moment that I wish I could have been there to see, God stops the flow of the Jordan River upstream. Now, this is crazy. Like, I want you to think about this with me, because it says that he stopped the flow and the water downstream kind of flowed on out, but the water upstream kept coming. And it was almost like God put this invisible force field in the river. And the Bible says that the water piled up in a heap, which I don't know what a pile of water looks like, but I would have really loved to have seen that. But that was God making good on his promise to Abraham and creating a path by which the Hebrew people were able to cross over into the promised land. And so they crossed over. And as they got over on the other side, God told Joshua, he said, Joshua, I want you to send one person from each of the 12 tribes. Now, this people group, this Israelite people group, God had divided them into 12 tribes according to the 12 sons of Jacob. And he said, I want you to send one member of each tribe back into the riverbed, and I want you to have them get a big rock. And I want you to have them put that rock on their shoulder and take it to where you're going to camp tonight in the promised land. And I want you to have them take those rocks and build an altar. And that altar is there for this purpose, that for generations to come, whenever a dad and his kid are out for a walk and the kid's like, Dad, what's up with that pile of rocks? That dad can look at that pile of rocks and say, hey, that's a memorial to the fact that God always keeps his promises and that God is all powerful. That God promised this land to us, God delivered it. We got to the river and it was at flood stage. God stopped the flow of the river and allowed us to cross over. Well, over the chapters of Joshua, they meet up with one pagan city, one pagan nation after another, and God was going before them, and God was fighting for them, and God was protecting them. And maybe my favorite of those stories was the very first one when they fought against the city of Jericho. So God comes to Joshua and he says, hey, Joshua, we're going to attack the city of Jericho. And Joshua's like, all right, now you're talking. What's the marching orders? God says, well, here's what I want you to do. I want you to take the entire 2 million people, and I want you to walk around in circles around the perimeter of that city every day for 7 days, and then I want you to yell as loud as you can. And Joshua's like, that's the dumbest idea I've ever heard. Like, that makes no sense. Why would I, that's militarily, that makes no sense. And God says, of course it doesn't. because I'm going to do something so extraordinary. In the end, I don't want there to be any way where you can take credit for it. And again, that's such a good word for us because God's going to ask you. God has asked me at times in my life to do something crazy, doesn't make any sense. Even when God asked me to move to Georgia and start Woodlands Camp, like there was nothing about that made sense. But God did it that way. So that for me, 23 years later, as we look around at all that God has done here, no credit could go to anywhere or anyone but God. Over the course of the next several years, the Israelites began defeating one nation after another. All the way up to the end of the book of Joshua, the end of Joshua's life. And Joshua makes this epic end-of-life speech. And he says to the Israelites, he says, choose for yourself this day who you're going to serve. Whether you're going to serve the gods of these pagan nations around us, or whether you're going to serve the one true God. But he said, as for me and my family, we're going to serve God. And that's the decision that you and I have to make every day. We have to get up every day and choose for ourselves who we're going to serve. Are we going to live for ourselves, or are we going to make the decision to live for God? Not long after that, Joshua died. Next time on Woodlands Plus, we're going to work through the period of the judges up into the period of the kings. And that will get you all caught up on the reading plan. And then from there, each week, we'll help you understand the big picture storyline of what you're reading in the Woodlands reading plan. And all that's to come next time on Woodlands Plus.